With a million different things going on in Warhammer 40,000, you never know what skill you need to master next. So I have the definitive list of things for you to work on right here in this video. You're going to get a lot of information thrown at you, but I'm really going to give you the exact path that you need to follow in order to take yourself from a 0-5 player to a 1-4 player to a 2-3 player to a 3-2 player, finally to a 4-1 player. And this is really the list that you just got to master in order to be good at Warhammer 40,000. So just follow along. I'm going to give you some good tips for each one of these points, and then I'll have future videos that's elaborating each point even more for you. So why this video? People often just feel completely overwhelmed by the sheer number of options in 40k. This is the list of skills that you as a player need to develop, regardless of what army you play. So you can play World Eaters, you can play Tau. These, you still need to develop these skills. Now, the way I want you to utilize this video is after you watch it all, you write down your list, or you, screenshot your list. I want you to pick one of these skills at a time and follow the steps that I prescribe to you so that you can actually develop. These are the first fundamentals that I actually ensure are developed by every single one of my coaching clients. Especially if they're newer clients. Some of my clients are more experienced and they're already 4-1 players and they're trying to win like their first major or super major, and we start on different things. But I ensure that everyone has these fundamentals down. So the last thing I need you to know about these, every single one of these pieces of advice has two sides. What you could do for your score versus how you can deny your opponent their score by doing these skills. So let's get right into it. The first skill is list building. Now this is really a video unto its own, and I've made a 10th edition list building video before, but I think it's probably about time to an update, so I'm going to get that out. But here's the short and dirty of it. When you are building your list, you're wanting to assign specific roles to the units to add to your army. Do not just add things and expect them to perform on the table. I actually just had a really productive coaching call earlier today where one of my clients had this really cool list that he had built, and I really, really liked it. There were just like maybe 3 units in it that didn't make sense to me, and they were all good units. But so the conversation that we had about it was removing some of those actually good units simply because they served no specific purpose in the list that he built. For example, let's say that you want to run, let's say you want to run a 5-man unit of intercessors. Well, a 5-man unit of intercessors is good. And you also want to give them a lieutenant. Okay, lieutenants are really good. But if you're running a lieutenant with the 5-man unit of intercessors, what does that change? Well, people will say, well, suddenly they're able to, get lethal hits, so they get to shoot up. Well, you're not wrong. They do actually shoot a little bit harder when they're led by a lieutenant. But is the unit that they are threatening different when they get lethal hits? And the answer is no. They don't threaten any units that they wouldn't threaten already. Just because you add a lieutenant doesn't mean this unit of intercessors, which is scary to storm boys, is now scary to rhinos. So you're not actually changing what that unit does in your army by giving them an objectively good attachment, right? So you wouldn't want to give that attachment in that scenario. Now, there are other scenarios where you would want to attach a lieutenant, for example. Now, suddenly your Blade Guard veterans actually can punch into a different class of unit. So there are reasons to do it, but not in that specific scenario. So basically the point is you need to have the role for the unit that you have in your army, not just using good units. Specific roles can include objective holding, secondary scoring, anti-infantry, anti-tank, movement blocking, deep strike denial, all of those things. You can also plan how to deny your opponent's respective units that have these abilities. So you can have units that are made to cause battle shocks to your opponents to deny their objective holding, their secondary scoring, things like that. So just keep that in mind. Number 2, controlling objectives. And now ultimately this Warhammer 40,000 is a game of how many circles can you stand on and how many circles can you deny your opponent standing on. Like, you just need more OC on a circle than your opponent. That's basically how you win the game. High OC units very oftentimes can beat low OC units, even if the high OC unit is a really bad unit and the low OC unit is a high quality unit. So let's take it from this. One of the things that I do all the time is I take a 40-point unit of Gretchen and I dash Custodes' hopes and dreams. You can have Valerian or a Blade Champion leading an entire unit of Wardens. This could be an almost 400-point unit, yet my freaking 40-point Gretchen unit stands on the objective, gives them the middle finger, and just giggles watching the Custodia player score no points because my Gretchen just has more OC. So you can have bad units that beat great units in the points trading category. Of course, they're never going to beat them in combat, but that's not their purpose. You're not trying to beat them in combat. You're just trying to deny them the points. And so you control the objective. Denying your opponent primary score is almost as critical as scoring your own primaries. Keep that in mind. And then lastly, what I want to say on controlling objectives, your high OC monsters and vehicles and bikes and things like this, they can't score primary for your opponent if they can't reach the objectives. This is where a skill called move blocking comes in handy. And I'm going to talk more about move blocking later on in the video. So let's go into the number 3 skill that I want you all to start mastering. Target priority tactics. This is so damn critical. I cannot tell you how many times people just choose the wrong target. So here's what you want to do. You want to focus your fire. You got to concentrate your attacks on one enemy unit at a time to ensure it is fully destroyed. Split firing is almost always a trap. Now, when I use the word almost, that's what I mean. There are scenarios where you should split fire. And what I mean by the term split fire is if I have a unit and I want to shoot all of my shots into a dreadnought, I think maybe I can kill the dreadnought and also kill the unit next to him. So I only shoot half the units in the dreadnought and I shoot half of my shots into, I don't know, the unit of intercessors next to him. That would be called split firing, splitting your firing. This is something that you rarely want to do. An example of a time when you want to split fire would be Chaos Knights. So Chaos Knights want to shoot their Havoc launchers into every unit on the board because they want every single unit to take at least one wound so that they can be under starting strength so that you can start activating your battle shock mechanisms against them. So there are times when you want to split fire, but it's almost always a bad idea. Then we look at threat elimination. You want to target the units that can either deal the most damage to your army or interfere with your strategy the most. So let's say you desperately need to be able to move your vehicles up a lane. Well, you have to be able to deal with their anti-tank firing guns that are going to stop you from doing that. Or you desperately want to move your tanks up a lane. Well, now you're going to have to deal with all of your opponent's little trash units that are going to be staying in the way that will be move blocking you. So threat elimination doesn't necessarily have to be just damage, but it can be things that interfere with your game plan. And then lastly, you want to ignore the bait. So this is a concept called baiting. It's when your opponent, or you, put out a unit hoping that your opponent will go to try to kill the unit because that's going to put them in a disadvantageous position. So you want to avoid wasting firepower on tough or unimportant units that don't really impact the mission. Because when you do shoot or try to kill those, tough or unimportant units, many times that can put you in a very disadvantageous position and allow your opponent to exploit it. Let's go into number 4, efficient movement. First off, you always want to pre-measure distances, right? Measure threat ranges before moving so that you can stay out of charge or shooting ranges of your opponent. If your opponent has a infantry squad that moves 6 inches and has a 24-inch gun, let's take Flash Gits, for example. That means that they have a shooting threat range of 30 inches. So when I move, and I know if I'm not going to be able to hide behind terrain, I want to make sure that when I finish my movement, I am 30.1 inches away from those Flash Gits so that they cannot shoot me. Right? So I've pre-measured that distance so that I don't accidentally go 29 or 28 inches and then just get lit up for no reason. So pre-measure your distances. Before you even start in your movement phase, if you want to charge an enemy unit, I would go ahead and measure exactly how far you'll have to move and what distance your charge will be. Because if you think that you'll be able to move up the table and get like a 7-inch charge, but when you measure it out, oh crap, this is actually a 10-inch charge, that can ruin your entire strategy. So pre-measure your distances. Then we have move blocking, which I said I was going to get back to it. And here we are. You're going to want to use small units to block enemy movement or charges by positioning them in key lanes. So for example, if I have a unit of scouts that are stretched between 2 buildings, a tank cannot move through those 2 buildings. It's literally can not move at all. There are times when your opponent might be using what's called a jail list. That's what we colloquially call them. And what these lists do is they literally just put cheap bodies in front of your army, meaning so that you can never move. And if you can't move, you can't ever get to the objectives and you can't ever score. And then lastly, I want you to think about advancing wisely. Advancing units when the extra movement is critical to scoring or avoiding threats. Sometimes it's better to not shoot if it means you will not be shot. A lot of times we don't want to roll the advance roll, or we want to guarantee that we get to shoot our guns. But if you're not going to be very efficient with your shooting, sometimes it's better just to not shoot at all and make sure that you are hidden. And you can do that by, having certain advances, things like that. Let's talk about number 5, terrain utilization. Hug cover, guys. You want to keep units in terrain with light cover so basically ruins, to boost your saves against enemy shooting. Now, this is a secondary strategy because ideally the first thing that you're going to do is you're going to hide from line of sight. You want to place units behind terrain that's blocking the enemy shooting. And in 10th edition, ruins, which is basically the only terrain there is, all block line of sight unless you're touching it. So you want to make sure that you don't get shot. And if you are going to be getting shot, you want to make sure that you have that sweet, sweet cover to help your armor saves out. Lastly, you can use like your terrain to block charges. If you're playing for just normal GW terrain, most people understand the standing 1.1 inches away from the wall trick. Basically, all that means is that you stand 1.1 inches away from the wall so that your enemy unit can't actually fit their base physically between the wall and your model, so that they can't actually stand there, meaning they can't charge you. But there's other ways to use terrain to block charges. You can have models in a certain position that make it so that a enemy vehicle won't be able to charge you because they're going to have to go around a ruin, for example. So there's lots of ways that you can utilize these terrain to block charges. Now let's talk about some charge phase tricks. And guys, these are critical for your melee army. So if you're playing your Blood Angels, your Orcs, your World Eaters, basically the things that I play, just pay attention to this one. So you've got multi-charging. This is when you declare charges against multiple units to tie them up or contest objectives. So for example, if I know that I really, really have to kill unit X, but I also want to tie up unit B, what I can do is I can declare charge against both of them, have all of my units attack unit A, or unit X, I guess I said, and then as long as I'm fully basing them, and then at the end of it, unit B is still engaging melee, and they won't be able to be shooting in their turn. You can also do a strategy called tri-pointing. What tri-pointing is when you take 3 models and you put them around a solo model. So what happens effectively is that it's going to be impossible for the solo model to be able to fall back without crossing over one of your models. And when they cross over one of your models in their turn to fall back, they're going to be forced to take a desperate escape test, which means they're just going to die on a 1 or a 2. Then you have what's called charge screening, which is effectively just, movement screening, but you do it to block charges. It's really, really quite simple. You can also use heroic interventions to block charges. So I've done this many times when I'm playing Orcs, where my opponent might charge into one of my units, and then I will heroic intervene with Gretchen, which will then block the second unit's charge, when the second unit was wanting to charge into my valuable target as well. Now they have to waste their charge into Gretchen, and it's pretty darn funny. Let's talk about some fight phase tactics. First things you want to do is you always want to pile in very wisely. If you have not read in depth the fight phase part of the rulebook, you need to read it, because this is something that a lot of people screw up. Use your pile in, which is an extra 3 inches of movement, even more if you have a stratagem to buff it, to get more models into combat, or reposition your models onto objectives. You can also use your pile-ins to defeat fights first units. This is something people screw up all the time. I'm going to get comments down below where people are going to doubt what I'm saying. Stop doubting, guys. This is literally just the way it works. You just need to go read the fight phase. Your units with fights first, let's say you charge a unit that has fights first. They will fight before you will. But let's say you charge a unit next to the unit with fights first, and then you pile into the fights first unit. You're fighting before they do, because the actual fighting activation starts with the pile in. And if your opponent did not charge and they don't start within engagement range, they can't activate. So you activate starting with the pile-in, and then you swing. So you can use pile-ins to defeat fights first. Then we've talked about interrupting combats. You can use command points or fights first abilities when multiple combats are happening. This can absolutely ruin your opponent. So let's say that you make, it's my turn and I'm charging you, and I charge 2 of my units. Well, if you have 2 CP, you could kill one of my two units that I charged with before I get to fight, which could be brutal, because the way it works is I will activate my first unit, and then you can spend your 2 CP to kill my second unit before they get to activate. This can force opponents to make interesting decisions when they are trying to dominate you in combat. Then you can focus down key targets. You want to ensure that high damage melee threats target the most important enemy threats. And this is kind of one of the things that I was talking about in the last slide. A lot of times people can use things like heroic interventions in order to force you to fight models that you don't necessarily want to be fighting. I don't want my Sanguinary Guard to have to waste their attacks into Gretchen because the Gretchen were able to heroic intervene, stopping my Sanguinary Guard from killing the Knobs or Gaz, Coolmac or Draka, something like that. All right, let's talk about maximizing unit efficiency. This is a really, really big one that a lot of people miss. You want to use overlapping buffs. You want to stack rerolls to hit and wound with +1 to wound, with devastating wounds. And you want to stack these on your best units to make them ungodly powerful. Or many times you actually want to stack all these buffs on a bad unit in order to make that bad unit perform like a much better unit, because many times your opponent is expecting your really good units to do lots of damage, but they're not paying attention to your weaker units. And if you can stack enough buffs on your weaker units to make them shoot really, really hard, you might just get a tactical advantage because your opponent didn't accounts for the position of your weak unit, and suddenly your weak unit gets to shoot something that is really, really vital because your opponent wasn't respecting them. But when you stack all your buffs, you're shooting much harder. You can target synergy units. You get to eliminate enemy units that provide key buffs. So, for example, if you're playing against the orcs, if you can kill Makari, then you're going to deny your opponent the lethal hits aura on their go turn, and that can be an extremely powerful blow to your enemy. So you want to target those synergy units if you're trying to stop your opponent from maximizing efficiency, but you want to use your overlapping buffs if you're trying to maximize your potential. Only a few more here, guys. We got 3 more here. So we've got command point efficiency. This is a huge one that I see people screw up all the freaking time. First off, you're going to want to save command points for key moments, using command points for rerolls or stratagems that will swing the game in your favor, not ones that are just nice. So, for example, if I am going to be turn 1 and I want to advance onto an objective with one of my units and I roll a 1, do I really need to spend a CP to re-roll that into a 2? Is that actually going to change the game? If it doesn't, do not re-roll it, because there will be a time later in the game where you desperately need that command point. You want to save those re-rolls for critical moments. Like, hey, if my character survives on this 1 4-up invulnerable save, I win the game. If he dies, I lose the game. Okay, that's a time to spend a command point re-roll. You can use defensive stratagems. You'll spend your command points on armor contempt, smoke, lone up, or similar abilities to make your key units much harder to kill. And then I really want you to think about planning ahead. Avoid spending your command points early on in minor effects. This is kind of what I talked about with your saving your CP for key moments, so that you have enough command points for late game plays. There are actually many times in the game where I decide to not score a secondary just so I can have more command points. Typically when I do this is if it's going to be a secondary like establish locus, and the only place I can do it is in the center of the battlefield. And if I do it, I know the unit that's going to do it is then going to get killed in my turn. Well, instead of taking those 2 points and losing a unit, I might just say, you know what, I don't need those 2 points, but I'll keep my unit and I'll gain CP for it. So there's times where you don't even necessarily need to score if it gets you more command points. 2 more here. We have, come on, maximizing secondary objectives. Speaking of secondary, I have the Calidus here because she's probably the best secondary scoring unit in the game. You want to focus on easy secondaries. So picking secondaries that align with your army's strengths and align with your enemy's weaknesses. So for example, most of the time in 10th edition, we're going to be choosing tactical as our secondaries. Occasionally, let's say you're playing against green tide orcs that have, they give up tons of points for Call the Horde and they have 9 characters, you might actually take Assassinate and Call the Horde. Similarly, if you're playing against, I don't know, Imperial Guard and they're running only tanks and like tank commanders and little characters are all around the place, you might actually choose Assassinate and bring it down for them. So choose the secondaries that focus on your strengths and your enemy's weaknesses. But still, I would tell you, if you're ever uncertain, just go tactical. It's almost always going to be a better option. Then score incrementally. Always plan moves that score secondary objectives consistently every single turn. This is one that people screw up all the time. Secondaries are not truly random. In Pariah Nexus, there are 18 secondaries in your deck if you're going tactical. You can always plan on scoring every secondary that you can draw. When you know there's a pool of 18 secondaries, you know what can be drawn. So you want to deploy in such a way that no matter what, if you draw containment, you're going to score containment. If you draw area denial, you're going to score area denial. If you draw cleanse, you're going to score cleanse. Occasionally, you can get screwed on this, and maybe you draw, overwhelming force and assassinate turn 1, and your opponent just hasn't given you any ability to score those cards. That can happen. It does happen, but it's actually pretty dang rare. Most of the times when people draw cards that they can't score, it's simply because they didn't plan for scoring the cards that they can draw. And then we also want to consider denying enemy secondaries. You want to position your units to block your opponent from scoring their objectives. If you know your opponent hasn't drawn Storm Hostile Objective and hasn't drawn Overwhelming Force and it's round 5, just move off of the objectives. Don't give them the ability to draw those two scores, do those two cards, and get good secondaries. Countering your opponent's strategies. This is the last slide, and I have one little bonus for you after this. Countering opponent's strategies. This is it. Whenever your opponent is trying to affect a strategy on the table, you want to stop them from being able to do it. You want to score, and you want to stop their scoring. So you always want to deny deep strikes. Spread units across your backfield to limit where enemy can deploy reinforcements. So if you have playing an army and they have lots of deep strikers, you want to make sure you spread your units out so that when their deep strikers come down, they're going to have to come down in a annoying place that they don't want to come down in. You want to punish staging. When I use the term staging, what I mean is putting their models in an advantageous position where they cannot be say shot, and they're going to be able to charge really well next turn. So your enemy's oftentimes going to want to position themselves in these strategic locations. You want to punish this with overwatches, counter charges, rapid ingresses, things like this. Do not let your opponent posture up on you for free. And then lastly, focus on the trash. Listen, many times in this game, your opponent is going to have devastating units, and you just won't know how to handle them. Whether that's Deathwing Knights, whether that's Mortarion, whether that is an unkillable brick of freaking Wraithguard, it doesn't matter. Death Star units tend to be much easier to deal with when you kill all of the trash scoring units that are very easy to kill, and you force your opponent to hold objectives or do actions with that Nightmare Death Star unit. So if your opponent has a unit that you just can't deal with, I recommend not trying to deal with it and just kill literally everything else and force them to do the things that they don't want to be doing with their really expensive unit. And just as a bonus for you guys, this is why we do coaching. So I just gave you this entire list of skills. And when you look at developing all these skills yourself, it can seem like a very daunting task. This is what coaching is for. Now, that doesn't mean you have to have coaching to develop this, but listen, the game is much more enjoyable when you enter the vibe state. When you just have these skills on repeat and you don't have to really think about them, your game's going to be so much more enjoyable. You're going to be sweating a lot less. You're going to be like pissed off at making bad decisions much less. You're not going to get mad about a dice roll not going your way because you're going to know that you made the correct decision. So you'll be like, okay, cool. Sometimes dice rolls go bad. It is what it is. You're not going to worry about being uncertain about how certain rules interactions work because you're going to have developed the knowledge of the game. And you're going to be maximizing your enjoyment for expensive tournaments that we all travel to. Guys, if you're spending $200 on plane tickets, $200 on your hotel, and you're paying $100 for the freaking tournament itself, sometimes it's nice to be able to perform at a tournament. So if you're concerned about performing, showing up, being able to play at just a little bit higher level, not even trying to win the tournament necessarily, but just to have a more enjoyable experience, coaching is for you. If you're trying to win these tournaments, coaching is for you. Extreme satisfaction is the final benefit of having coaching, because when you start winning by outplaying your opponent and not outrolling your opponent, damn, Warhammer is in a beautiful place. Anyway, these are the skills that I recommend everyone freaking develop. If you're looking for coaching or help, learning all these skills, make sure you follow the link down below to my coffee, where you could book coaching calls, you can book a coaching membership, you can even book a coaching game where we will play a game together and I will point out all of the mistakes that you're making and I'll teach you how to fix the mistakes. So you can book at the link below. You can also jump in the Discord for our regular TTS leagues and all of the just constant conversation that we have in there. So until next time, all of my grots and gits, I appreciate your attention. I hope this helps you out. Crump on. Bye-bye. Have a good one.